Sure.
How is Jesus called God in the New Testament to you? What does that mean for you? If you recognize, let's say hypothetically, Hebrews chapter 1, you brought it up.
Mm-hmm.
It says the Father says to the Son, your throne, O God, is forever. When the Father is calling the Son God,
Mm-hmm.
what does that mean for you?
The term God means mighty one. And in that text in Hebrews 1:8, it's a direct quotation from Psalm 45, verse 6, where an Israelite king, back then, most likely Solomon there in Psalm 45, is referred to as God, and it's due to him ruling and reigning in God's stead upon the earth. So the Israelite king, especially if he was a righteous king, would be like a visible representation of the invisible God. That text about King Solomon is applied, I would argue, midrashically to Yeshua in Hebrews 1:8. But in Hebrews 1:9, it says, therefore God, even thy God, has anointed thee. So
Mm-hmm.
even there, when Jesus is called God, he's said to have a God over and above him that has
Right.
anointed him with the oil of gladness above his companions.
Right. I don't actually disagree with that because I understand the context talking about how the Father would be, as we had briefly talked about before, in roles, the Father would be over him. What is your interpretation of verses 10 through 12 when you keep reading and it
Mm-hmm.
says, and continue the thought of the Father speaking of the Son, and you, meaning Jesus the Son, and you, Lord, in the beginning laid the foundation of the earth. The heavens are the work of your hands. They will perish, but you remain. They will all become like an old garment. Like a mantle, you will roll them up. Like a garment, they will be also changed, but you are the same. Your years will not come in. In verse 10, the same flow is going on of the Father speaking of the Son. He says, and you, Lord, in the beginning laid the foundation. This is kind of implying and teaching back to Psalm 102, if I remember correctly, how the Son was involved in the creation of the very foundation of the earth. How do you respond to that?
I don't believe he's referring to the Son, verses 10 through 12.
Why not?
The last,
All right, go ahead.
because the last reference there in verse 9, your God has anointed you, that's a reference to Yahweh the Father anointing Jesus, who holds the title God in the secondary position. The author then gives somewhat of a doxology in verses 10 through 12, citing Psalm 102, 25 through 27, because when you go back to Psalm 102, 25 through 27, it shows that there is stability with the servants of Yahweh because Yahweh has placed them in that position. So likewise, the author of Hebrews, pulling from that psalm, says in the same way that Yahweh makes his servants, the servants of him back at the time of the psalm was written, he makes them stable. The Son's position above the angels as the resurrected immortal Son, the high priest in heaven, everything that Hebrews 1 talks about, the resurrected Jesus, his position will maintain stable because Yahweh, the God of Psalm 102, the God that's praised in verses 10 through 12, has given him that position.
So reading Hebrews, thank you for your answer. So reading Hebrews 1, going back to verse 5, it says, for to which of the angels did he ever say, you are my son, I'll be a father of him? Then he says in verse 5, when he again brings the firstborn into the world, he says, let all the angels of God worship him. Then it gets down, like you said, in verse 7, he says, verse 8, but of the Son, he says, verse 9, you, again, so your throne, verse 8, you have love, righteousness, verse 9. But for some reason, when we get to verse 10, you is still not being spoken about Jesus. I find that confusing if you're allowing the flow of the context from the previous verses that are speaking directly of the Father speaking of the Son, but for some weird reason in verse 10, that stops.
Well, I told you the reason before in verse 9. In verse 9, the your God that anoints Jesus is spoken about there in verse 9 over and above Jesus.
I'm
And
not
when you go,
disagreeing with that directly, just so you understand. I'm still trying to go with the flow
so
of
it's,
verse 10.
yeah,
It says, and you, Lord. So there's this continuation of the same verses 7, 8, 9, 6, 5, all of these verses speaking of the Son, and you, Lord. There seems to be this continual flow of this these statements in reference to the Son. But for some reason, for you, meaning Matt, you don't believe it's continuing, but it seems to be, from what I'm reading, continuing.
it's praising the God that anointed Jesus in verses 10 through 12.
Okay. Because even in verse 13, again, the continual thought still is going, which the angels ever said, sit at my right hand, referencing Psalm 110. So it seems to be from verse 5 directly all the way to the end of verse 13. All of these verses are stating something about the Father speaking of the Son.
Yeah, like I mentioned before, the Father is praised in verses 10 through 12 when you backtrack it to Psalm 102, because he is the one that has given this position to Jesus over and above the angels. The first chapter of the book of Hebrews is written to show the preeminence that Jesus has over the angels since he's been resurrected. You don't use an entire chapter to prove that somebody is higher than the angels if that somebody actually is Yahweh.
Well, I would disagree with you. I think the book of Hebrews chapter 1 is a very, not that I want to go away from this, but same thing with John 1. There's a specific purpose for when this was being written. I mean, just going back to verse 3 of Hebrews 1:3, it says, he is the radiance of his glory, the exact representation of his nature. That Greek, which I'm assuming you've studied, is hypostasias correctar, which means Jesus is that express image of his nature or essence. So this again would be a verse I would believe the author is pointing to the supremacy, to the deity of Jesus Christ, and then lays out going farther in regards to comparing. Well, he's not an angel, he's above the angels. He talked about the angels worshiping him. He says that your throne, O God. And then, like, I'm not voiding verse 9. I don't think I am. But there's this whole context going on about this emphasis of the preeminence of the Son. Reason why he can be the hypostasias correctar is because he is one with the Father. And I believe verses 10 through 12 talk about how the Son would have been there in the very beginning as the origin of things being created.
Yeah, there's a lot. I don't think you answered my point in all of that.
What was your point? What did I miss? Go ahead.
That an entire chapter here was written to show Jesus's preeminence over the angels. That's the whole point of chapter 1. You don't write that if that person is already Yahweh. It doesn't make any sense. So there's arguments.
I don't think it's just the angels, though, if that's what you thought I was trying to say. It's not just that. It's talking about who this Son is, because verse 1 says, God, after he spoke long ago in the prophets in many portion ways, in these last days spoken to us in his Son.
Right, in the last days, not the former
is referencing. Sorry?
I said,
sorry?
He spoke to us by his Son in the last days, not in the former days.
In these last days.
Yeah, not in the former days.
Before the incarnation of Christ, which I believe he pre-existed, before that, God spoke through prophets in different ways.
Not through the Son.
Well, not directly as we did through the incarnation. Of course not. That's the whole point of the incarnation, of what Christ came to do, is speak of the Father. That's what I believe the point of Hebrews 1 is specifically talking about, that Jesus Christ came to speak of the Father, to directly reveal who the Father is.
Yeah. What does the Greek word character mean?
It means the very character, the very being of a person.
Are you familiar with the lexical entry on character?
I can look up my BDAG if I need to real quick. What would you like to look up here?
That'll work.
While I'm doing that, what would you, if you want to share your thoughts real quickly, feel welcome to do that.
The word character basically means a copy. It was used in Greek literature to refer to an imprint that was made in some hot wax on a king's signet ring. So the word character of his hypostasis there in Hebrews 1:3, again, we don't need to read later Trinitarian development in the 4th and 5th century AD back into Hebrews 1. When we read Hebrews 1, that he's the character or the copy of his person, his hypostasis. We should read that as though the resurrected Christ, which is what Hebrews 1 is about, the resurrected Christ, shows forth the Father in the same way that seal is left on that piece of wax from the signet ring of the king.
Okay. So when I'm looking here, go ahead.
I was just going to say it goes along with similar with when Jesus said in John 14, if you have seen me, you have seen the Father. You and I would
Right.
agree that that would not make him the Father. You don't have a problem with that. You would say Jesus is not the Father, even though he said, when you've seen me, you've seen the Father.
Right.
And what I'm saying is that when you see Jesus, you see God. That doesn't make him the one God. He is a copy of the one God. He shows forth the Father and the one God's uh, power, might,
Right.
character.
So what I'm looking
Behavior.
here, I'm looking in the BDAG, and it talks about the word exact representation here. It looks under number 2, says about how Christ is the exact representation of God's real being, exact, not just a copy. I have another source here from the Concise Greek English Lexicon from Danker, William, and Krug, what also says authentic representation, the express in of the person of God's essential being and identity. So this would, to me, as I'm looking at this would be telling me that Jesus is the very essence, the very nature, the very being of God come in the flesh. I did a study on this a while back. I was looking at some of my notes as well. And I have other sources that I could look at. But my point of what I'm sharing is when we're reading, I mean, this is, of course, we could table this and talk about some other stuff too, but my thought, I'll let you have the final word. My thought when I'm looking at Hebrews 1, from the very start to the very end of the chapter, the author is really wanting to emphasize the coming of the Son, which I again believe would be pointing to his pre-existence, pointing to his superiority of angels and other beings and authorities, and he's even being the one attributed in verse 10 through 12 as being the one in the very beginning as a source, a creator, which Psalm 102, verses 24, 25, 26, 7 attributes to God.
Yeah. Yeah. And my view on Hebrews 1 would be that God did not speak by his Son in the former times, but he only spoke by his Son in the latter times, in the last days. The Son has obtained a very prestigious position because of his resurrection. He is the exact expression of God because he is the chosen Messiah. He's the chosen vessel through whom God will redeem the world, redeem mankind. And he's superior. For a little while, he was made lower than the angels, as it says later in the second chapter of Hebrews. But after his resurrection, he became over and above the angels. God gave him that position. Your God has anointed you. Your God is the Father. That's the one God, has anointed Jesus, who holds the title God in a secondary sense, just like the king in Psalm 45:6. And therefore that God, your God, is praised in verses 10 through 12. He will maintain that position that he has given to the Son because he is the creator. So that's my view on Hebrews 1.
I'll honor my word and give you the last word on that one there.